I would like to share with you a little bit about our speaker today. We are pleased to have our friend, Dr. Rachel E. Williams. She is a public health and mental health expert with extensive experience working on climate-related health challenges in the small island developing states. Her work focuses on understanding how climate impacts affect mental well-being and how evidence can inform more inclusive and effective climate responses. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today. And in case any of you would be interested in reading a little more of what she has been sharing with us, we already have a published blog on our website. So I'll be sharing it in the chat in case you guys want to check it out. So I will go ahead and let Rachel introduce herself and tell us a little bit about what is your experience and what have you learned from studying this specific topic so far.
Good afternoon, everyone from Trinidad. You may be here from different time zones. Thank you to ITACA for inviting me for this session. And my interest in this field really started in health more than 20 years ago, but in the area of mental health more so because I struggled with depression twice in my life, in my 20s, and then between 2016 to 2020, I struggled again with it. I was managing home care for my mom in the last 6 years before she passed at the end of 2024. And she had early Alzheimer's and she also struggled with depression. So I learned a lot about this in the last 6 to 7 years, especially how I got out of depression without using medication. I used two of the techniques which I'll be mentioning later on, which is spiritual healing and music. So my interest in health started more than 20 years ago because I worked as a health research scientist when I came back to Trinidad in 2004. I worked with what was known then as the Caribbean Health Research Council, which was one of the regional bodies that was integrated into what is now called CARPHA, which is the Caribbean Public Health Agency.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And well, in this case, we are going to start with as I mentioned, your mental health background and how you've done this research. So I would like to ask you from your research, like all the research that you've done, how does the prevalence of mental health conditions such as anxiety, depression, and neurocognitive conditions like dementia or Alzheimer's in the Caribbean compared to global averages? And what are some of the underlying factors that help explain why this burden is already higher in that region?
Okay, in terms of actual percentages, unfortunately, the Caribbean, the percentage of Alzheimer's and dementia in the Caribbean is between 8 to 11% versus 6.5 to 6.9% in Europe or North America. So in the Caribbean, it is higher. In terms of suicide, suicide is highest in Guyana in the Caribbean, but the rates of suicide in our region are comparable to what's outside. However, if you look at anxiety, the rate of anxiety in the Caribbean in 2021 is about 7.3% compared to 4.7% globally. Okay, so it's much higher in the Caribbean. And some of the factors, the underlying factors are we don't have enough mental health practitioners in the region. Across Latin America and the Caribbean, on average, we have 3 psychiatrists per 100,000 people, compared to over 18 per 100,000 people in the developed world. So we are a sixth of what is currently happening in the developed world. Apart from not having enough mental health practitioners, most people cannot afford care. In one of the documents, I looked at PAHO 2024, where PAHO stands for the Pan American Health Organization, which is a regional arm of the World Health Organization, it is actually stated that for millions of people, including those in the Caribbean region, accessing affordable and high quality medicines poses significant challenges. Another underlying factor is that access to care remains one of the biggest barriers. And a key point here is that mental health stigma. I was not aware of this until today when I started looking at percentages. About 60% of people actually think that it is taboo to mention that they have a mental health issue. 60% of the population, that is extremely high. And added to that, about 70% of people cannot access mental health care in the Caribbean. Another factor is that people don't realize that poor eating habits, low physical and mental activities also contribute to mental health issues.
Well, I do appreciate that. The statistics are very, very impressive. And building on that baseline, let's go ahead and talk about how does climate change interact with this, like existing challenges in the Caribbean islands, and in particular, um, how do climate-related stressors, both extreme events and slow onset changes, increase mental health risks in the region that it's already carrying such a high burden?
Okay, for those who may not be familiar with the climate stresses that we face in SIDS, let me just briefly say we face extreme rainfall and winds, coastal and inland flooding, coastal erosion, a rise in ocean acidity due to the increase in the carbon emissions worldwide. We have freshwater sources becoming saline because of the previous fact. We have land and marine heat waves. We also have increases in invasive species and vector-borne diseases. For example, malaria, dengue, yellow fever, and leishmaniasis have all increased as a result of climate change, because one of the key things that climate change does is it intensifies mental health issues, because warm ocean and air temperatures amplify the severity of hurricane hazards, increasing wind speeds, rainfall totals, and flood risks. The first question you asked me had to do with rates prior to climate change. Instead of anxiety, now you're hearing about the term eco-anxiety, which is directly related to natural disasters. A lot of the youth are experiencing eco-anxiety. That was a term I only learned like about 2 years ago. Something else was happening, and this happened with Hurricane 2019. We had Hurricane Dorian, which was a Category 5 hurricane that hit the Bahamas. And we have a lot of separation from families, which is increasing stress. We have people who actually witnessed death where people bodies were floating down rivers. We have loss of property, extended disruptions of electricity, water, communications, transport, food supply. So all of these things are increasing the mental health burden, and all of these are as a result of climate change stresses in our region. We also have damage to local health systems. You have a delayed response in people actually being able to access healthcare. In a lot of the cases, especially in 2017 and 2019, we had Hurricane Maria. We also had, in 2017, we had Irma and Maria. In 2019, we had Dorian over the Bahamas. 2017, Dominica got a lot of the damage. And I remember soon after that hurricane, the government reached out to the government in Trinidad and Tobago asking if we could take some of the school children, because I believe for a whole year, in some places, there was no school. because the schools were damaged. So climate change is high, it is magnifying the mental health burden in our region.
Thank you so much for sharing that data. And in your work, and specifically in the blog, you mention and identify several gaps in the evidence linking climate change to mental health. So, which of these gaps concern you the most? And why do you think mental health has remained so underrepresented in climate research?
For those who may not have read my blog, briefly, gap one was the lack of studies on public mental health intervention in SIDS. Gap two was unknown consequences of the long-term effects of climate change on mental health in SIDS. Inadequate research is gap three on mental health and well-being impacts caused by gradual changes due to climate change. Gap four, we have limited research on the impact of climate change related migrations on mental health. And the last gap I identified was lack of research on the use of effective music and spiritual interventions as therapeutic options. And for me, the worst gap is the long-term effects of climate change because it is affecting all ages in the society, but in particular, the youth. The youth are our future. And if we cannot help the youth cope adequately with what is happening before or after a climate change event in the future, we are going to be in a lot of problems. In terms of why is mental health underrepresented, in my opinion, and based on what I've been reading, I think there's a lack of awareness regarding the true extent of the problem in terms of the actual percentages of those who experience either anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, and on the older scale of the age bracket, we have Alzheimer's and dementia. Only recently did I learn that the incidence of anxiety is much higher in the Caribbean than outside. The incidence of Alzheimer's and dementia is also a bit higher than outside the region. So a lack of awareness regarding the true extent of the problem and incorrect focus. I have a colleague who is almost 80, and he works in the area of selling medical technology. And he made a statement to a former Minister of Health in Trinidad some years ago, stating that the Ministry of Health should be renamed as the Ministry of Disease, not the Ministry of Health, because the focus is not on prevention of diseases, it is in cure of diseases, okay? And I agree, because most of the money in the healthcare sector, too much is focused on medicine, medical equipment, medical supplies, infrastructure, but not helping people to prevent getting mental health illness. And as I mentioned before, mental health stigma is huge. 60% and more feel talking about the fact that they have a mental health problem is taboo. So you have 60% and more of persons suffering in silence. And this is not only them, it is also the healthcare providers. They also are exhibiting signs of stigma towards patients. So it's on both ends of the coin. That is a huge problem in the group.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and we welcome you back again. We had a couple of interventions from other people that are participating, but now that you can share with us what looking ahead looks like, what would be practical ways that you would say the practitioners, government, or development partners would be able to just change the or strengthen the mental health resilience in the Caribbean? And this is something that you pointed out. This could be before the climate events occur. That's something that's prevention, not just as a reaction, right? So from your perspective, what would be those kind of preventive or preparedness actions that can help reduce the mental health impacts in the
Okay.
future?
First of all, the concept of One Health, the One Health approach is something I only learned about last year. Basically, everybody collaborating together. We can't continue to have fragmented approaches. We can't continue to have siloed approaches, not sharing of data, not sharing information. But one of the first points I have is to strengthen primary health care because currently medical doctors have what is known as CME, which is continuing medical education. One of the things that I think is mandatory now is that we add a course on climate science and or a course on mental health. That is one suggestion I have because hurricanes, floods, disasters are only intensifying in our region because of the increase in the use of fossil fuels and carbon emissions on the developed side. We are not the ones causing the problems, but we are the ones feeling the problems. Something else that I've learned is the benefits of spiritual healing and music. As a musician myself, I saw firsthand how music helped me during COVID when everybody was in lockdown. I saw how it helped my mother who experienced early Alzheimer's. It didn't progress significantly because of music and spiritual healing. Music therapy and art therapy can be introduced as allied health professions in the medical faculty. There is enough evidence in the literature about the benefits of art therapy, music therapy, and spiritual healing. Disaster-trained mental health professionals are scarce. We need to advocate for more of those professionals. We need to incorporate climate change education, for example, not only for the medical doctors, because currently at the University of the West Indies, there are 5 branches, one of which is online. In Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, the only mandatory course right now is English. Plus, in Trinidad, history. In Jamaica, it's a different course. In Barbados, it's a different course. If we have a mandatory course in climate science or something in disaster management, mandatory. So all university students at all levels have to take this. We have to increase awareness. We have to increase education. The next 2 points are from a colleague of mine who normally leads the Franciscan Institute trauma team in the region. She just came back from Jamaica about 2 weeks ago. And she is saying we have to have trauma-informed school environments to help school children, parents, and caregivers. We have to create a community of support, which is especially important before and after a disaster. The second point she makes is we have to have regular public education campaigns, not only by the media, but communities, community groups, religious organizations, youth groups, NGOs. Okay? One point I want to make is research has demonstrated that there is a significant positive relationship between spiritual health and mental health in patients with chronic diseases. On the averages, we have 84% of the world's population is religiously affiliated, and 68% of unaffiliated individuals believe in a higher power. In the Caribbean, it is a strong presence of people having faith. We are not focusing on the right thing. We need to strengthen resilience before another disaster hits.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And well, now this is the section where we open the floor for anybody who has questions or would like to add something to the discussion. And you can raise your hand or just open the mic and contribute to the conversation if you have any questions directly to Rachel, or if you would like to share any personal experience.
Maybe I'll start because with the last point that Rachel was making, something came to my mind that I wanted to share as well in relation to the religious community. Um, there's a book called The Phoenix of Natural Disasters by Patton, 2008. Why do I remember it so much? Well, because it talks a lot about this issue. And it particularly talks about the difference between a community that has strong cohesion and strong resilience versus a community that doesn't. What the case studies in the book show is that communities with a stronger cohesion tend to tend to demonstrate what is called post-traumatic growth after a disaster. So an example is, for example, the Bok tsunami in Thailand, right? So actually, because the community was healthy as a community, the event actually helped spark innovative ideas on better ways to build, to grow food, etc. That's called post-traumatic growth. Another example was with Katrina in New Orleans, and it compared communities that were part of religious groups with those that weren't, and found that those communities that had a strong affiliation to a church, those communities recovered faster from Katrina and had the lowest rates of emigration from the area than others. They were able to get back water, electricity, and many things much faster because they were acting as a coherent and consolidated group through their church. So I think to your point of like, within the mix of things that we have to consider, we have to think of mental health also in relation to our community. So the individual's mental health with relation to the overall well-being on the community, because what these studies have proven is that when the community has strong resilience, it can help lift up, you know, um, specific individuals. So I highly recommend that book to anyone who is interested in community resilience and I wish I could see more examples from the Caribbean in the future on how enhanced community resilience leads to post-traumatic growth after extreme events. Thank you.
Can I add to that, Carla? Because I got two other points from my same colleague who is the head of the coordinator of the Franciscan Institute Trauma Team. She says governments in each territory need to have, this is after, governments in each territory need to have a standing team to respond to disasters locally. Putting together a team when a disaster occurs is not effective. You have to have that team in place before a disaster occurs. And the second point she says is there also needs to be an established protocol for mental health professionals to respond to disasters. And then she says the Franciscan Institute Trauma Team has such a protocol which they follow when they offer assistance to a territory. Something else I would add is early warning systems. Based on what I have seen, Barbados has done a lot of work in developing an early warning system for dengue in collaboration with the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology in Barbados, the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research in Panama, plus other agencies. And I don't know if you all remember in 2010 that earthquake that killed hundreds of thousands of people in Haiti. Part of the problem there is that they did not adhere to strict building codes. And a lot of people died because buildings collapsed because they did not adhere to codes. That is something that we need to start doing. Because I went to Haiti with a few of my friends. And one of the things, there's several things I remember, but one thing stands out. It was on an Easter weekend in 2013. And Saturday night at 10 o'clock at night, we were walking to the pastor's house to get dinner. There was no electricity, but they had candles in the church that we passed. And people were singing in the church at 10 o'clock at night to candles. I'll never forget that. So I experienced some of what they faced. And this is not going to stop unless we keep advocating for change.